Get out! This is not a place for a filthy man like you to just walk into.
Officer Trent Malloy's contemptuous shout cut through the air at the doorway of the Jefferson Courthouse in Birmingham, Alabama. Right at the entrance to the courtroom, a police officer blocked the way. One violent shove sent the folder flying, papers scattering across the marble floor. The old soldier fell hard, and a child standing nearby tugged at his mother's sleeve, trembling. "Why are they hurting him, Mom?" No one answered. Not the judge, not the officers, not a single soul in that crowded courtroom. His name was Elijah Cross, 62 years old, a retired Navy SEAL. A man who had once carried his brothers through fire and bullets, now dressed only in a worn gray coat, clutching a crumpled folder. No titles, no medals, just an ordinary witness, carrying a truth that could change the entire trial. No one there knew yet that the silence and dignity of this man would shake the system and force an entire city to listen. He had entered the courthouse with a simple purpose: to help an old friend. Yet only minutes later, Elijah Cross, veteran Navy SEAL, 62, was lying on the cold stone floor, blood seeping from his hand. He carried crucial evidence that could save a comrade from injustice. But instead of being welcomed as a witness, he was slammed to the ground because of the color of his skin. Amid the silence of the crowd and a judge sitting motionless on the high bench, Elijah still rose. Sweat on his brow, blood at the edge of his eyes, yet his posture stood tall like a flagpole. He had endured humiliation and pain on battlefields, but he had never imagined facing the same in his own country, inside the very halls that were meant to represent justice. Elijah wore no uniform, no gleaming silver medals on his chest, only a simple gray coat and a battered leather folder clutched in his hands. The Jefferson County Courthouse, the largest courthouse in Birmingham, Alabama, echoed with the sound of his footsteps across the marble hall. He had come here for one purpose: to testify for Marcus Hale, his comrade who had lost a leg, a man whose disability benefits had been abruptly cut off without warning. Inside that folder were medical records and government documents proving Marcus's right to support. But as Elijah approached courtroom 2B, a figure in a blue uniform blocked his path. Trent Malloy, a white officer in his 30s, stood squarely at the door. The shine of the badge on his chest glared under the overhead light, but his eyes were dark, scanning Elijah from head to toe. "Are you sure you're in the right place?" he sneered. Elijah stayed calm. "I was summoned as a witness in Marcus Hale's case. These documents belong to the court." Malloy gave a cold chuckle, refusing even to touch the folder. "Alone? No lawyer? You look less like a witness and more like someone here to pay a parking ticket." Elijah's voice remained steady. "I only need to deliver them directly to the clerk. These are certified medical records." "You speak as if they mean something." Malloy tilted his head. "They do," Elijah answered firmly. "For justice." The air grew tense. People waiting on the benches lifted their heads. A clerk behind the desk peeked out. Malloy stepped closer, voice low and sharp. "If you want respect, you should dress like someone who belongs in a courthouse. Right now, you look like a stranger off the street." Elijah tightened his grip on the folder, his tone calm but unyielding. "I served 30 years in the Navy. I've stood where one mistake meant death. Don't lecture me about discipline." The smirk vanished from Malloy's face. "Then you know what happens when someone refuses to obey. Get out. This is not a place for a filthy man like you to just walk into." Elijah lifted his head high. "I didn't come to beg. I came to testify." Silence fell like a blade. A child's voice broke it. "Why did they push him, Mom? He didn't do anything." The mother had no answer. Malloy's patience snapped. With a hard shove, the folder burst open, papers scattering across the marble like autumn leaves. Elijah collapsed to his knees, blood smearing as his hands scraped against the stone steps. He did not groan, only drew in a sharp, breathless gasp between pain and disbelief. He stared straight into Malloy's eyes. The officer stood unmoved, stiff, unapologetic. The crowd began to fall silent. Some exchanged uneasy glances. Others shifted as if they might intervene, but hesitation froze them. And then, from a distance, came the sound of wheels rolling. Marcus Hale, the one-legged comrade, pushed his wheelchair forward, his voice ringing out stronger than any judge's gavel. "That is the man who dragged me out of gunfire in Kandahar. He pulled me through the sand while bleeding himself." The words struck the courtroom like fire to dry tinder. This was no longer just a shove at a courthouse door. This was living testimony that a hero was being treated like a criminal, inside the very country for which he had bled. Elijah was still lying on the cold marble floor. He wiped a thin line of blood onto the sleeve of his gray coat, his hand trembling, yet his voice rang out with quiet determination. "You can knock me down, but I will still stand." Malloy was about to reply when a small sound broke the tense air. "Mom, why did the policeman hurt him?" A boy, no more than 7 or 8, clung to his mother's sleeve, his wide eyes full of confusion, fists clenched tight. There were no tears, only the raw bewilderment of innocence. His mother bowed her head as if wishing the moment would pass, but it did not. It lingered, spreading outward like a slow stain. The hallway filled with uneasy whispers, hovering between outrage and fear. People wanted to speak, but the weight of habit kept them silent. At that moment, the courtroom door opened. Judge Robert Langley entered, tall, silver-haired, his black robe perfectly pressed. His eyes swept over the hall, stopping briefly on Elijah sprawled on the floor, then slid away. There was no word about the blood, no mention of the scattered documents, no acknowledgement of the humiliation before him. He simply nodded to Malloy and strode to the bench as though nothing had happened, as though the system itself had chosen not to see. Elijah pushed himself against the wall, slowly forcing his body upright. Every muscle protested, but pride held him steady. A drop of blood rolled down his lip, yet his eyes never wavered from the front. A young female clerk hurried forward, kneeling to gather the papers scattered across the floor. Her hands shook, but she worked quickly, as if even an act of kindness might draw unwanted attention. Elijah looked at her and whispered, "Thank you." She did not answer, only kept gathering the pages. Malloy stepped back, his stare still fixed on Elijah, not seeing a veteran but a thorn to be removed. Elijah stood straight, blood still flowing, clutching the battered folder like a weapon, not one of bullets, but of truth. He walked toward the courtroom door, and this time no one dared to stop him, not because he was permitted, but because something in the air had changed. People might not remember his name, but they would never forget the way he stood up, not in rage, not in surrender, but with the quiet defiance of a man refusing to be erased. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was heavy, as if time itself had stopped breathing. Marcus Hale clenched his jaw, his hands trembling not with fear, but with suppressed fury as he watched his brother-in-arms struggle to rise. He tried to wheel himself forward, instinct screaming to protect his comrade, even at the cost of his own pain. But a guard gently pressed a hand to his shoulder, whispering, "Don't make this worse." "Worse?" Marcus wanted to shout. "Since when is defending the man who saved my life a crime?" But he swallowed the words, his fists tightening on the armrests until his knuckles turned white. Meanwhile, Elijah dropped to one knee, picking up the papers one by one like broken feathers. He did not curse, did not complain. Every movement was deliberate, steady. His hand trembled, but his gaze was iron. It was not weakness, but restraint, the discipline forged in years of combat and in silent battles fought on his own soil. From the third row, a young woman watched. Maya Jackson, a law student, had come to observe, hoping to learn from the real world. But what she saw today was not a lesson. It was an indictment of the system itself. With her phone hidden in her sleeve, she pressed record. Her hand shook, Her eyes cracked with realization. What broke inside her was not pity, but recognition. Malloy's voice cut through the silence again, low and cold. "Sit down, boy." He did not need to shout. The contempt in his tone froze the room. To Maya, it was the same sound her grandfather once described. The tone of Southern men who wore their uniforms like crowns, believing power came from a badge instead of justice. Elijah froze for only a moment. He lifted his eyes, not with anger, but with a patience so deep that it made the insult echo twice as loud. He did not answer, did not react. He bent down again, picked up another page, and in that silence, thunder roared. The courtroom was full, yet no one stood, no one spoke. Some turned away, others stared ahead like statues. In the back, a reporter scribbled furiously, uncertain if he was covering a trial or history itself. The boy spoke again, voice trembling. "Mom, why is he bleeding?" His mother hushed him, placing a hand on his shoulder. But her eyes never left Elijah. This was not silence. It was surrender. It was complicity. The quiet acceptance that in America, a black man could be knocked down in court, and the only response would be the rustle of papers and the smirk of a badge. But Maya had seen it, and her camera was rolling. Elijah gathered the last page and slid it back into the folder, now wrinkled and faintly stained with red. He held it tight against his chest as though it were his last shield, honor itself, the one thing no one could take away. Elijah rose to his feet, not quickly, not theatrically, but with a quiet strength, the kind that doesn't demand attention, yet refuses to bow. He did not look at Malloy, because in that moment, every eye in the room had already seen what had happened, even if they tried to pretend otherwise. The silence that followed was not peaceful, but suffocating, thick as if the very air had turned to stone. People held their breath. They had watched him fall, and now they watched him rise. Yet when Elijah straightened his back, it seemed he was no longer just himself, but a symbol of something larger. Then a voice rang out, clear, seasoned, authoritative. "That man is Elijah Cross." Heads turned as an older man stood from the second row. Tall and broad-shouldered despite his years, his silver hair gleamed under the courtroom lights. He wore a dark gray suit, and on his lapel, a small American flag pin caught the light. His eyes, sharp as steel, locked on the judge's bench before finally shifting to Elijah. "He once commanded SEAL Team 6 in Kandahar. He carried 3 wounded men under heavy fire. One of them was me. His name was Robert Langley, retired Major General, a legend in military circles, decorated with countless honors, and a man known for speaking only when it mattered." Today, he had chosen to speak. Malloy's jaw tightened. The smirk he wore so easily vanished. He faltered between Elijah, Langley, and the judge, who still sat frozen at the bench, her gavel untouched. Langley did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. Truth does not shout, it simply stands. Elijah Cross does not need a uniform to command respect. He earned it with blood, with silence, and he never once asked for applause. He stepped forward, stopping 3 paces from Elijah, and raised his right hand in a sharp military salute. The entire room held its breath. Elijah lifted his eyes, and for a fleeting moment, pain flickered there. Not from the wound, but from the burden of being forced to reveal a past he had never wanted to use as a shield. He had come here as a witness, not as a soldier. Across the aisle, Marcus Hale gripped the wheel of his chair, his knuckles trembling. He whispered to Maya, his voice breaking, "He never told me. Not even me." Maya wiped at her eyes before a tear could fall. Her camera was still rolling, but what she saw was no longer just injustice. It was the soul of a system cracked wide open, exposed in silence and shame. An old veteran in the gallery, his faded POW MIA cap tilted low, nodded slowly, lips pressed tight. A young attorney in business attire dropped her gaze, perhaps realizing she too had stayed silent for too long. And still, the judge said nothing. Langley lowered his salute, then turned to the gallery. His voice sliced through the room like a blade. "You want to talk about dignity in this courtroom? Then start by looking at the man who still stands after you kicked him down." He gave Elijah one final nod and returned to his seat. The silence that followed was no longer heavy with contempt, but filled with shame, awe, and something like the first breath after being held under water too long. Elijah did not smile. He didn't need to. He gathered the last page from the floor, straightened it carefully, and lifted his chin. In that moment, the room no longer saw a man in worn clothes. They saw a legend, one who had never asked to be called that, but whose name now echoed through every corner of the courthouse. The next morning, in her small dorm room, Maya Jackson sat alone, her eyes fixed on the laptop screen. The upload box blinked at her, waiting. Her hands trembled over the trackpad, caught between hesitation and resolve. She had not edited a frame, added no music, no subtitles, only the raw truth. Elijah Cross slammed to the floor, the suffocating silence that followed, and the salute that shattered it. She whispered to herself as though in prayer, "Let the truth speak." Then she pressed post. Within the hour, her phone buzzed non-stop. By noon, the video had passed 1 million views. By nightfall, it had doubled. Comments flooded in from every corner of America, some stunned, others furious, many carrying just 2 words: "I remember." The media erupted. Headlines spun across television screens and news feeds. War hero assaulted in court. Decorated seal thrown down before he could testify. A legend's blood on the courthouse floor. None of them said it outright, but everyone understood the undertone. This was not just about a man being knocked down. It was about why a man like him was treated as if he were trespassing in his own country. Marcus Hale, still reeling from the sight of his friend collapsing in that courtroom, agreed to an interview with a local reporter. He sat in his modest apartment, medals lined neatly on the shelf behind him, his voice low but unyielding. "They called him a ghost soldier," he said. "He did the work no one wanted to talk about, and now they want him invisible again." The silence after his words felt heavier than the words themselves. By the next day, veterans across the country began to speak out. Some in wheelchairs, some still in uniform, some with tears streaming down weathered faces. They didn't just speak of Elijah. They spoke of their own quiet erasure, the feeling of being discarded after service. A man who had carried others through gunfire, now treated as an intruder in a courthouse he had every right to stand in. That image was the final straw. Out of nowhere, a hashtag emerged, born from a single comment. By night, it was everywhere. "Stand with Elijah." Maya leaned back in her chair, staring at the numbers climbing on her screen. She saw anchors struggle to keep their composure as they read the headlines. She saw Elijah's former comrades sending in photos, videos, letters. Some spoke of him. Others, for the first time, shared their own buried stories, tales of pain and silence hidden for years. One clip struck the nation hardest. A silver-haired veteran, hands trembling, held up a faded photograph of 4 men in uniform. He pointed to the tall figure standing at the back. His voice shook. "He saved my life twice, once in Afghanistan and once yesterday, when he reminded me that silence only makes injustice stronger." In the middle of the storm, Elijah Cross chose silence. He did not hold a press conference, issue a statement, or post a single word online. Instead, he returned quietly to Birmingham, where he sat on the worn steps of Marcus's small apartment, holding tight to the crumpled folder he had gathered from the courthouse floor. Yet his silence echoed louder than any speech. Reporters kept calling. Social groups took to the streets. Even a few cautious politicians demanded an investigation. But Elijah said nothing, because he knew the story wasn't just about him. It was about a system that had forgotten who it was supposed to protect. From Chicago, a radio host ended his program with a voice that cracked just slightly. "Maybe Elijah doesn't need to say a word," he said, "because this time, for once, America is speaking for him." And right there in Birmingham, without reporters or flashing cameras, Elijah sat quietly and watched a young boy pedal past on a bicycle, waving a small flag with 3 words scribbled in marker: "Stand with Elijah." They had thought silence would bury him, but the silence had grown too loud to ignore. The next morning, the courthouse steps in downtown Birmingham were no longer empty. Veterans in faded uniforms and civilians carrying handmade signs stood shoulder to shoulder in the early light. At the very front, Marcus Hales sat in his wheelchair, navy cap pulled low, lifting a sign with trembling strokes that read, "He fought for you." By noon, news crews had arrived. Cameras flashed. The crowd swelled by the hour. Inside, Officer Trent Malloy still walked the marble halls with his badge gleaming as though nothing had happened. His boots echoed with the same swagger, but the eyes around him had changed. Some turned away, others narrowed. Pressure was building. Soon after, Birmingham's Internal Affairs quietly opened a case into Malloy's conduct, pushed by the mounting outrage. An anonymous leak surfaced online, revealing that Malloy had been the subject of at least 5 prior complaints of racial bias and excessive force, all dismissed without a hearing. Now, those complaints were plastered across national news. The following day, Elijah Cross returned to the courthouse. This time, he sat quietly in the very last row. No spotlight, no statement, just a steady presence. His back straight, his coat folded neatly over his lap, his eyes watching everything. Maya Jackson came back too, no longer simply a law student observing a civil case, but a witness to something larger than case law itself. The fire in her chest hadn't gone out. She slipped into the seat beside Elijah, hesitant to speak. She didn't have to. From the back, the courtroom looked unchanged. Judge Hadley sat on the bench with the same cold detachment. The bailiff's face gave nothing away, and Officer Trent Malloy once again stood by the door, though this time his glances were more guarded, less defiant. Then Marcus rolled forward to the witness stand. His voice was slow, cracked with years of grief, yet heavy with resolve. "I lost my leg in Kandahar," he said, turning toward the jury, "and the man who saved me is sitting right there." His hand trembled as it pointed, but his intention was unmistakable. Every eye followed his gesture toward Elijah in the back row. Elijah Cross hadn't come to seek recognition. He wasn't there for thanks. But Marcus's words cut through the silence like a blade. If the law would not listen to a war hero, then who would it listen to? The room went still. A young boy in the gallery tugged at his mother's sleeve again. "Mom," he whispered softly. "Why did the police hurt him if he was a hero?" His mother didn't answer. Her eyes brimmed with tears. Outside, the protest continued to swell. Flags waved in the autumn air. The chants rose, not with anger, but with a quiet determination. Veterans, teachers, nurses, and citizens of every color and age came together under one banner. A reporter thrust a microphone toward Elijah as he left the courtroom, asking, "Do you have anything you want to say to the nation?" Elijah only shook his head. Later, Maya approached him once more, her voice low but insistent. "Why won't you say anything? They're waiting for you." Elijah held her gaze. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, in a voice both gentle and unyielding, as though teaching rather than defending himself, he replied, "I did speak. In the way I stood up. That was enough." That single line spread faster than any prepared speech. Within hours, it appeared everywhere, on banners, in headlines, across social media. "I did speak. In the way I stood up." It became not only Elijah's rallying cry, but a symbol for every quiet act of dignity that had been ignored. And with it, the illusion of invincibility surrounding Officer Malloy, and the system that had protected him, finally began to crack, because this time, Silence wasn't shielding him. It was condemning him. The very next morning at 8:30 a.m., retired General Robert Langley, once a legendary commander, appeared live on CNN. His voice was deep, steady, carrying the weight of decades in uniform. When the anchor asked what he thought about the video now sweeping across America, Langley did not blink, did not dodge. "We owe him, and we failed him," he said. After a pause, his voice sharpened. "That man carried me through gunfire in Fallujah. America awarded him medals, but right there, on that courtroom floor, he was treated like an intruder." The interview exploded, ricocheting across social media. By noon, the National Veterans Council had issued an open letter to the governor of Alabama. The headline, in bold, "When silence equals betrayal, we demand accountability." Meanwhile, Birmingham's courthouse was strangely subdued. But outside, the steps were lined with rows of veterans, some in wheelchairs, some with canes, some standing at rigid attention. All held signs scrawled with the same message: "He fought for you. Now fight for him." Marcus Hale, sitting in his battered wheelchair, rolled forward to face the cameras. His voice was hoarse but clear. "He saved me once under gunfire. Today I'll repay that debt in front of the world." The statement became the lead story of the evening news, and by nightfall, it had transformed into a national slogan. Every replay of Maya's raw footage sent the wave higher. Law students at Howard launched a letter-writing campaign to the Justice Department. The mayor of Birmingham was forced to answer live on air. "Do you support an investigation?" Even a hesitation was enough to send his approval rating plunging. Inside the police department, the aftershocks spread. Malloy was summoned to a closed-door session with Internal Affairs. Some said he walked out pale as chalk. Others claimed he smirked. But one truth was undeniable. The city wasn't smiling anymore. A week later, Elijah Cross received a formal invitation from the United States Senate. A special hearing on veterans' rights and racial injustice in the judicial system. They wanted him there. Elijah didn't respond immediately. Maya found him sitting alone on a stone bench outside the courthouse, his eyes fixed on the door where he had once been thrown to the ground. "Elijah," she whispered, "they're listening now. You can speak for thousands who can't." He turned to her, his face etched with years of silence. "I already did," he said softly, "in the way I stood up." That same day, a mural began to rise in downtown Birmingham. Painted by a group of veteran artists, it depicted Elijah in two halves, one side in uniform, carrying comrades through smoke and fire, the other kneeling on the courtroom floor, bleeding, gathering scattered papers. Across the center, in solemn gold letters, "Justice does not wear a badge, it wears a backbone." The story crossed borders. International networks debated the role of race in America's courts. Civil rights groups demanded reform of courthouse security. And in kitchens and living rooms across the country, families began asking, "Have we truly honored our veterans?" But Elijah Cross remained silent. No press conference, no posts, no declarations. The world had already heard him. In his fall, in the blood staining the marble floor, in the way he rose again, and in the silence powerful enough to shake a city to its core. When the day of the Senate hearing arrived, the chamber was packed. Not from curiosity, but from respect. Veterans in faded uniforms, families of the fallen, young officers, students, and Maya herself, clutching her phone like a sacred artifact. At the center, Elijah Cross sat upright, silent, dignified. When the judge nodded, Maya stepped forward. Her hand shook as she pressed play. No music, no edits, no effects, just the unvarnished truth. Elijah thrown down, papers scattering, Marcus shouting, the child asking why, and blood shimmering on cold marble like something sacred defiled. The room froze. Someone muttered, "My God." Others bowed their heads. Marcus adjusted the small American flag pin on his chest and turned to the committee. "I saw him carry 3 wounded men through gunfire. I was one of them. The military called him the Ghost because he never left a trace. But today, this country dragged him like a stranger. The air was suffocating. And then Elijah stood. Not hurried, not trembling, but with the certainty forged by a lifetime of discipline. He didn't look at the cameras. He looked at faces, each and every one. His voice carried, low and steady. I bled for this flag, not for your approval, not for comfort, but for something greater, justice. He didn't shout, he didn't weep, but the silence that followed thundered louder than any explosion. Even the presiding judge leaned forward, as though his words had reached a place the law books could never touch. Malloy, seated off to the side, dropped his gaze. The jaw that once sneered now quivered. And in that moment, America understood. Elijah Cross had no need for more words. He had already spoken, by standing up. The cemetery lay silent, wind whispering through rows of white headstones, standing like soldiers forever at attention. Elijah walked slowly, each step pressed into the earth as though afraid to wake the past. In his hands he carried a bundle of lilies wrapped in brown paper, the stems still wet. He stopped before a flat stone etched with two names, her name first, then his beneath it. At the bottom, an inscription read, "She healed where others were broken." Elijah lowered himself to one knee, joints stiff from old wounds, and laid the flowers down with both hands. His fingers trembled as they traced her name, as though searching for a heartbeat hidden in the cold granite. "I did it," he whispered, letting the wind carry the words away. Behind him came the faint sound of wheels on gravel. Marcus appeared, carefully guiding his chair across the path. On his lap rested a neatly folded American flag, its edges sharp, its blue field bright with stars. He said little. He simply placed the flag beside the flowers and murmured, "For the man who saved me twice. Once in Kandahar, and once in that courtroom." Elijah said nothing. He didn't need to. The silence between the two men spoke volumes. A boy passed by holding his mother's hand, the same boy who had once asked aloud in the courtroom. He froze, staring at Elijah, then tugged at her sleeve. "That's him, the man who stood up when no one else would." The mother looked at Elijah, eyes glistening, and nodded with quiet respect. Elijah rose again, slower this time, but steady. Before him stretched a sea of graves, some marked with flowers, others with flags, some bare. He stood there, his shadow long across the grass as the sun sank behind the trees. No music, no applause, only wind and memory, and the whisper of a nation just beginning to understand. And then, on the steps of the Jefferson Courthouse, they raised a bronze statue of Elijah Cross. Not towering, not grandiose, just him seated, a worn folder resting on his lap, his gaze fixed forward, calm, resolute, searching for what truly mattered. No uniform, no medals. On the morning of its unveiling, there were no drums, no speeches. Only a small gathering stood in silence. The breeze stirred a white flower at the base of the statue, making the bronze plaque gleam. He stood without shouting. He moved the world. Marcus, dressed in the same weathered jacket he had once worn when Elijah saved him under fire, sat in his wheelchair just behind. He raised his hand in salute, not to the government, not to the court, but to the brother who had carried him through bloodied sand and again through a room full of indifference. Maya stood nearby, lifting her phone to record, not to spark another wave, but as a promise. Her eyes reflected the bronze, capturing not a protest, but a vow that they would remember who had stood up when all others sat still. As the crowd thinned, a familiar figure appeared at the corner of the square. The same 8-year-old boy, clutching his mother's hand, pointed at the statue. "Mom," he whispered. "He's the one who stood up when no one else did." She bent down, nodded. The boy studied the statue once more, then said softly, "One day, I want to be like him." They lingered in silence, the boy's small hand wrapped tight around his mother's. They paid no attention to cameras or hurried pens of reporters. They came not for that. They came to see dignity made visible, dignity that needed no explanation. Marcus wheeled closer, placing the folded flag in a glass case beneath the bronze hand of the statue. His voice was nearly carried away by the wind. For the man who saved me twice, once on the battlefield, once in the courtroom, and both times he asked for nothing. Inside the courthouse, behind the statue, the machinery began to shift. Training protocols were rewritten, complaint systems reformed. Trent Malloy was stripped of his badge, dismissed quietly. The once silent judge faced an ethics investigation. The system had not collapsed, but cracks now ran to its core. The name Elijah Cross appeared in ethics courses across universities. Veterans everywhere wore pins marked EC on their chests. Churches lit candles in his honor. Online, people debated the meaning of his silence. In Birmingham, the questions long buried in avoidance finally rose to the surface. Elijah never returned to the courthouse. He had said all he needed to by saying nothing more. Instead, every Sunday, he brought flowers to his wife's grave and sat for hours. Sometimes Maya joined, listening to the wind. Sometimes Marcus rolled up, telling old stories of baseball or battlefields. But mostly, Elijah sat quietly, letting the wind speak for him, the language of dignity. And so, the statue was not just a monument. It became a memory cast in bronze, a reminder that strength is not always loud, that justice sometimes wears humility, and that one man rising in silence can force an entire city to stop turning away. If you ever pass by the courthouse in Birmingham, stop for a moment. Look straight into the bronze eyes of Elijah Cross. You won't see anger. You won't see pride. You'll see only a quiet question waiting for you to answer. Because some stories don't need thunder to shake the world. Sometimes, one man in a crowded room, choosing to rise in silence, leaves the deepest mark of all. Elijah Cross never shouted. He never asked for the spotlight. Yet his silence named an entire system and forced a city to listen. This story reminds us, dignity is not loud. Courage isn't always a battle. Sometimes it's simply standing when your body bleeds, when your spirit aches, but your will refuses to break. So what do you think is stronger, an angry shout or the steady silence of a man who refuses to be erased? Tell us in the comments below. If this story touched you, take a moment to hit like, share it with someone who still believes in the power of quiet strength, and subscribe to join us for more true stories that stir the heart.